Hello everyone. Welcome to the BISV High School Usable Club. Today we'll be covering the basics of plants. If you're interested, that's Campbell's chapters 29, 30, and then we jump to 35 and 36. So we have a lot of material to cover today. I'll get right into it. So we begin with chapter 29, plant diversity, how plants colonize land. So plants evolved from green algae. Um, the specifically from a group called charophytes. Now the evidence for this is both both plants and charophytes have rings of cellulose synthesizing proteins. Other photosynthetic unicellular organisms have like linear cellulose synthesizing proteins in their cell wall. They plants, or at least the early plants, have flagellated sperm, and they have a phragmoplasm. One adaptation that enabled them to move to land is sporoplenin. This is a durable polymer that is inserted into cell walls that prevents against desiccation. It's like a waxy substance. It prevents the plant from drying out, or specifically spores. Here are the derived traits of plants. As a reminder, a derived trait is a trait that is common to the members of a species because to the members of a clade or a group of organisms because of con like the it wasn't given to them from a common ancestor. They developed them as a result of evolutionary pressures. So here are the derived traits. You have alternation of generations. So in plants, they're like as a contrast, us humans, we are almost exclusively diploid. The only time where you see haploid cells in humans is gametes. In plants, however, plants have distinct multicellular structures that are both haploid and diploid. So the plant life cycle alternates between a haploid structure, then to a diploid, and then the diploid produces the haploid structure. The haploid structure produces the diploid structure. So this just keeps on alternating. Hence why it says alternation. Each generation, the ploidy of the organisms flip. Plants have multicellular dependent embryos. This is only possible because plants adapted to be multicellular. Uh, I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. The plants have walled spores produced in sporangia. These improve spore survivability on land. They have multicellular gametangia. These are multicellular structures that produce the gametes. The gametes are haploid, which fuse to form the sporophyte, which is the diploid form in the alternation of generation. The female gametangia is called the archegonia. The male gametangia is called the antheridia. So anther archegonia. They have apical meristems, which this is at the tip of a growing branch or a growing plant body. This region controls cell division and growth of that entire branch. I think we'll get into the regulation of the rest of the branch by the apical meristem later. And plants also have a cuticle. This is a waxy outer covering that, again, as plants move to land, they need to prevent desiccation. The cuticle guards against water loss. And stomata. These are openings on the surface of the plant, usually on leaves usually on leaves that can facilitate gas exchange. They can open and close. Yeah. This is some more about the alternation of generations. So as you can see, the plant has a diploid structure known as a sporophyte. It undergoes meiosis. Certain cells in the gammatengia undergo meiosis, which produces haploid spores. Each haploid spore develops into a gametophyte, right? And then the gametophyte is a multicellular haploid structure. Then the gametophyte with mitosis produces haploid gametes. These gametes fuse to form it. This is similar. This is basically the same as how human fertilization works. It fertilizes, forms a diploid zygote, which develops into a sporophyte. So you can see how the cycle continues. Here are the types of plants. Ooh. Generally, you can categorize plants into depending on their vasculature. Vascular plants can be divided further into vascular plants with seeds and vascular plants without seeds. We'll get into these two categories later. And non-vascular plants, there's one group, bryophytes, which are commonly called mosses. Okay, so mosses, mosses are divided into three phylums: liverworts, hornworts, and just plain mosses. Here is the life cycle of a moss, of yeah, of a moss. As you can see, they also undergo alternation of generations. One important thing to note is that mosses release their gametes into liquid. They have flagellated sperm, and therefore the sperm will swim towards the eggs. And because of that, mosses need to be in a humid aqueous environment so that their sperm are able to swim. They can't their gametes can't travel through the air, so there needs to be water. And bryophytes are thought of as the first step from green algae towards what was it? Flowering plants, angiosperms that we think of today when we think of plants. That concludes chapter 29. Chapter 30, Plant Diversity 2, the Evolution of Seed Plants. So here we get into the vascular plants. Remember, bryophytes are non-vascular. These plants have vasculature, which means that there are conducting tissues, tissues that bring nutrients and water from one part of the plant to another. We'll get into that in a bit. Seed and pollen grains are key adaptations for life on land. These two aspects are very important for life on land, specifically because let's talk about pollen grains first. Pollen allows the gametophyte and their gametes to be transported through air. This allows, because they can be transported through air, they don't need water. This allows the plants to move away from an aqueous environment and into a more terrestrial environment. The seed is important because it protects the zygote from desiccation. As you'll see, a lot of these adaptations are guard against dehydration, desiccation. And yeah, adaptations reduce gametophytes. Let's go back to mosses. Here you can see that these are the gametophytes. You think of them as large. The moss that you actually see is the gametophyte. It's a dominant structure, dominant part of a moss. The sporophytes are just the stalks that come off the top and release spores. In mosses, the gametophyte is a dominant form, but as we move to vascular plants, the gametophytes become reduced so that they can be transported through the air via pollen, right? Another thing is heterospory. So every single flowering plant, every single vascular plant can produce both male and female gametophytes. And this just makes it easier for fertilization to occur. Ovules and production of eggs. An ovule is the place where the female gametophyte is stored, which eventually develops into the zygote. One important thing that you should note here is the integument. It's parent tissue that nourishes the developing embryo. It protects and provides nutrients for their offspring, which is evolutionarily favorable. And pollen production, sperm, yeah. So one class of vascular plants is called gymnosperms. These are so-called naked seeds, and if you look to the right, you can see how the seeds are exposed, not covered in, not coated in any kind of fruit or any structure. The one major group of gymnosperms are conifers. These conifers consist of pines, firs, and redwoods. Here's the life cycle of a pine. The pine tree, the actual big tree that you see is called the sporophyte. It's the diploid structure. And on the tree develops cones that serve for reproduction, right? So the cones are split into male, I guess you can think of them as male and female cones, but each tree will produce both types of cones. The male cones have microsporocytes, and microsporocytes will undergo meiosis in these pollen cones to produce pollen. And pollen is the male gametophyte. Megasporocytes, on the other hand, will undergo meiosis inside the ovule in the other cone. So it might be a bit hard to see. If I zoom in, does the screen share also zoom in? Anyways, I hope you can see this. You can see there are distinct morphological differences between pollen and ovulate cones. The megasporocytes in the ovule and the ovulate cone will divide and form the female gametophyte. So there are separate structures for producing male and female gametes. And here is a second and dominant class of vascular plants. The angiosperms are everywhere. They're the most common types of plants, and odds are, if you think of a plant in your head, it's going to be an angiosperm, right? So the distinctive structure, the distinctive feature of an angiosperm is its flowers. So angiosperms are the only flowering plants, and they consist of all flowering plants. Let's talk about the anatomy of a flower. So a flower consists of 4 parts. You have the sepal, which is if you guys see a flower bud before it blooms, it's still green. It has like leaves that come out and over the flower bud. Those are the sepals. So when the flower is developing, it envelops and protects the flower, right? As the flower expands, as you can see, the sepals also expand, and they end up as these little leaves at the bottom. The second structure are the petals. These petals serve to attract pollinators. They're usually brightly colored, they're usually brightly colored. They can have specific structures that like mimic the body shape of a pollinator. That's an example of coevolution. But yeah, they're used to attract pollinators. Next, we get to the reproductive structures of a flower. The male reproductive structures, the parts that produce, no, petals are not supposed to. So petals attract bees. Um, think of it as you're waving a flag, like a colored flag in someone's face. Uh, if it's brightly colored, then someone's gonna see it more easily, right? Um, then yeah, okay, sorry, stamen. Uh, the stamen is a male. You can think of it as a male reproductive structure of the flower. It consists of the anther, which is where the sperm, the gametophytes are actually produced, and the filament, uh, which connects the anther to um, which connects the anther to the base of the flower. Mm, yeah, and then the female reproductive structure is called a carpel. So a carpel consists of three parts. There's a stigma, which is used to it catches pollen and it's sticky. It catches pollen, and pollen will germinate into the ovary from there. Um, then there's the style, which is a tube that um, the pollen will grow through the style into the ovary. So it's a connecting duct between the stigma and the ovary. And the ovary houses the ovules which contain the female gametophytes, the eggs and stuff. I'm trying to move a bit fast because we have a lot of slides today, but if you have any questions, shoot me a direct message. All right. So, more about flowers. Reproductive adaptations of angiosperms include flowers and fruits. Most angiosperms can cross-pollinate, so they can pollinate with other with other members of their species, and I think other angiosperms as well. This enhances genetic variability. Let's go back to the bigger picture of the flower. So the pollen, let's say, let me draw this. Let's say, so the anther right here, this structure will produce pollen, right? This is let's say this is a pollen grain. The pollen will go and stick to this stigma. Not necessarily this stigma, but because we don't have another flower, I'll just use this as an example. It will stick here, and then it'll germinate into a tube that reaches down the style into the ovary, right? And then so it like grows inside the style. And then once it reaches an ovule, it will discharge its sperm into it and fertilize the egg. Yeah. Yeah. Does that make sense? So I'm gonna erase it. Okay. Clear all my drawings. Yeah. This leads us to the idea of double fertilization. So plant pollen grains will produce two sperm cells. And you might be thinking, why would you need two sperm? One of these sperms will fertilize, oh, sorry. One of the sperm will fertilize the actual egg, the structure that will develop into the zygote. The other sperm will fuse with a, what's it called? Polar nuclei in like the central big cell, and that will form the endosperm. And what the job of the endosperm is to kind of it works with the integument, the parent tissue, to provide and nourish the developing embryo. And then the zygote will develop into a sporophyte, like we said. Yeah, and one way, this is just a classification thing that I think we have more on this later, but cotyledons they're called seed leaves. And this was a bit confusing for me at first because when you think of leaves, you think of green flat structures, but necessarily always um they're not always like big, and they're not always, you won't recognize them as leaves at first. Just just know that if there's one cotyledon, it's a monocot, and if there's two cotyledons, it's a eudicote or a dicot. Um, uh, and angiosperms can be further divided into monocots and eudicots. So there are two categories. They have distinct morphological differences. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see that they differ in the number of cotyledons, the orientation of their veins, the arrangement of vascular tissue, what kind of roots they have, their pollen grains, and flower petals. All right. The rest, these two, you probably don't need to know. Not as important. Chapter 35, vascular plant structure, growth, and development. So first plant organ that we're going to talk about are the roots. And as you may know, the roots function to absorb water and minerals. They can store food, and they almost always provide support. There are two different kinds of roots, kind of. There's the primary root, which is the original root that was produced with the zygote. So this is like the OG, the very first root. And there are lateral roots which will branch out of the first root, and it'll just branch out from the first root, right? And then here are two different types of root systems. The first is called a taproot. So a taproot is basically a root structure where the primary root will grow like very thick and extend deep into the soil. This is generally found in like very tall plants, because this taproot system will provide support against like toppling over of the plant. If you have a pole and you stick it really far in the ground, it's harder to push it over, right? There's more anchoring support that way by the taproot. It allows the plant to grow tall, prevents toppling, one thick primary root that reaches deep in the soil. And the taproot, it does branch off a little. It's not like just only one and only root, only one root, but the main structure is that most of the root is the primary root. The fibrous root system, on the other hand, is think of it as like a matted root system. The roots extend a lot. They branch a lot within like the shallow layer of soil. The primary root dies early on, and you have a thick mat of lateral roots. Because there's a lot of surface area, this is very helpful in preventing the plant from being like uprooted. So let's say you have a plant that herbivores like to eat a lot, and when they bite down and they pull up to like yank a piece of the leaf off into their mouth, if you have a taproot system, it's easier to like uproot the entire plant out. And when you do, that plant's done for, right? You can't replant yourself into the soil. So this fibrous root system holds the plant into it prevents the plant from being pulled up. As a result, this also is good at preventing erosion. One interesting thing to note is that these lateral roots are adventitious. That's just a vocab word. It means emerging from an unusual location. These roots will actually erupt from an underground part of the stem. They grow out of the stem and become roots. So they were originally cells, part of the stem, part of the shoot, but then they became roots. Yep. Now the rest of the plant, the stems and the leaves. So the stems, the function of the stem is to support and elevate the leaves and their flowers, right? If a plant grows tall, it won't get outshaded by other plants because they're all competing for sunlight, right? Also, if a plant manages to elevate its like reproductive structures, pollen can disperse farther because it starts out from a higher altitude. Here's some more vocab about the stem. So a node on a stem is the point at which a leaf attaches to the stem. So this would be a node right here, right? If you can see my mouse. An internode is the space between the nodes. So between each leaf, the part of stem between each leaf is called the internode. You have the apical bud, which is the tip of extending branch or stem. This is what we talked about before, the apical meristem. This is the tip of the extending branch or stem. It contains stem cells that will control the growth of not only itself, but the rest of the branch. This is mainly how plants extend or grow. They also, other than the apical bud, they also have axillary buds. So on every leaf, at like the upper angle, so here's your stem, here's a leaf, right? This is stem, this is a leaf. At this, right here, at this angle, there is an axillary bud. And these are buds with potential to grow into a new branch, but they're inhibited by the apical bud. So think of them as dormant buds, dormant stem cells. Yeah. And other stems, we usually think of stems as being above ground, but they can also be underground. Like potatoes are a modified version of a stem. Moreover, like we said over here, the adventitious roots grow out from a part of the stem that's underground, right? The main job of leaves is photosynthesis and transpiration. Photosynthesis, we'll get into both of these. Grass leaves have a sheath over the stem. That's like a niche example. So if you look at a blade of blade of grass, its stem is actually within that blade. So the actual blade that you see is it's a leaf that's covering, that's ensheathing the stem. So think of it as like a sword, and it's like sheath. I hope you can visualize this. Yeah. Leaves, this is we talked about before, a difference between monocots and unicots. So monocot veins are parallel and they're equally sized. Unicots have branching veins. So they have one major vein called the midrib, and all the other veins branch off them, right? Let's go back here. You see top, thank you. The top is a monocot. These veins are parallel. You see all the parallel lines. Down below, oh, sorry. Down below, these veins are they branch out they're not parallel. They branch from a middle vein, and these are midribs, right? Yeah. Okay. Um, more about plant anatomy. So other than the three types of plant organs, so the three plant organs are stems, leaves, roots. Plants also have three types of tissues. One interesting thing to know about these tissues is that they're continuous throughout the plant. So uh, let me get into the tissues first. So the three types are called dermal, vascular, and ground tissue. Dermal tissue is the single outer layer of cells. It, like our skin, it acts as a shield. It consists of the cuticle, which is the waxy outer covering on plants, right? It also has guard cells. These regulate the stomata, which open and close to regulate gas exchange and transpiration. Well, I'll discuss transpiration in a bit. And trichomes. Trichomes they're like secreting cells. They're not always secreting cells. They defend against herbivores. So they can secrete toxins, or they might be like spikes or something. Um, it's a defensive mechanism. That's basically what you need to know. Second type of tissue is vascular tissue. So vascular tissue is it provides support and it transports nutrients. So the xylem and phloem, these are the two types of vascular tissue in an angiosperm, will provide support for the stem. We'll see that we'll see that in a bit. And these vascular tissues will transport nutrients. So like the roots will pull in water, and the water will get pulled up through xylem, through vascular tissue to the leaves. And the phloem transports sugar and other larger molecules. Yeah. More vocab. The stele, S-T-E-L-E, or I'm not sure if there's two L's, but it's called the stele. This is the name for all of the vascular tissue. So it's just a general term. Then finally, you have ground tissue. So this is tissue that is like, that isn't dermal and it's not vascular. So it makes up the most of the plant. And this tissue, it's important to note that it's not like filler tissue. It's not there just to take up space. These tissues perform most of the metabolic functions of the cell. Sorry, not of the cell, of the plant, right? So ground tissue is further divided into two categories. You have the cortex, which is the outer layer of ground tissue. So this is ground tissue. If you think of the stele as like a ring, as you see here, the light blue is the dermal, the yellow is the ground, the purple is the vascular, right? So everything outside in this layer is the cortex. It's outside, it's between the dermal and the vasculature. This is the cortex. And then within the vasculature, so like if you think of the vascular tissue as a ring, it isn't always, but in this case it is. The tissue within the vascular system, so like in this circle, is the pith. Yeah. And then here are the three. Now, okay, so we went from organs to cells, to organs to tissues, and now we're going to cell types, individual cells. So, first cell type are parenchyma cells. So these cells have thin cell walls, and they do most of the metabolic work. So they perform the reactions, they carry out photosynthesis. Yeah. Collenchyma cells are the second type of cells, collenchyma. These are cells that provide flexible support. So they're they have thick primary cell walls. And okay, it's important to note that the parenchyma and collenchyma cells, they're alive at maturity. So once these cells are fully differentiated, they're still alive. They still perform metabolic functions. They still maintain their internal environment. Sclerenchyma cells, on the other hand, these have thick secondary cell walls. So collenchyma has thick primary cell walls. Sclerenchyma has thick secondary cell walls. And these cell walls are reinforced with lignin. And lignin is a waxy, tough polymer that it adds to the strength of sclerenchyma. These cells are dead at maturity. So in contrast with parenchyma and collenchyma, sclerenchyma cells, before they fully differentiate, they actually the sclerenchyma cells will die and leave behind their cell wall as like a skeleton that keeps maintaining its structure. Sclerenchyma cells are divided into sclerides and fibers. Sclerides are boxy. They have very thick cell walls. Pairs have their gritty texture because they contain sclerides. And fibers are long and tapered sclerenchyma cells. These are often grouped in strands. They're very tough. So we make ropes out of these, like for example, hemp, right? That's like a very tough, long fiber. All right, so now we get into what the different types of vascular tissue are. So there are two types of vascular tissue. One is xylem and one is phloem. Xylem transports water and ions. Phloem transports sugars, larger solutes. Excuse me. Phloem transports sugars, larger solutes, amino acids, and hormones. So xylem cells are dead at maturity. While I keep going, if you know what kind of cell xylem is made of, shoot me a direct message. So xylem consists of dead cells with tough cell walls reinforced by lignin. That's a dead giveaway. See, dead giveaway. I'm sorry. And there are two types of xylem. There are tracheids, which are long and tapered cells. So if you look to the right, taper just means that it like pinches off. You have like a tube and then it gets thinner, right? Water flows through pores in the cell wall. So water will transfer from one tracheid to the other between like the weakenings pits within the cell wall. The second type, these are like generally long and thin. Second type of xylem are vessel elements. These are like thick tubes. They're not tapered. These are like what you think of them as like pipes, right? They connect end to end instead of like tapering off and like squeezing into another. And and they connect between the vessel elements connect to each other through perforation plates. These are also just weakenings in the cell wall that allow water transport. Remember that normally the cell wall is relatively intolerable. Water can't pass through it easily. But with these weakenings, water can go through. And then xylem is dead at maturity, right? But phloem, on the other hand, is alive at maturity. Yes, thank you, Mary. Impermeable. That's what I was looking for. Phloem, on the other hand, is alive at maturity. These are cells that, well, I already went over what they did, but the cells that make up phloem are called sieve tube elements. Sieve tube elements. These are cells that, although they're alive, so they maintain their internal environment. They have a living cytoplasm and a cell wall, but they're devoid of organelles. So they have nothing except their internal cytoplasm, right? So how do they maintain? How do they keep themselves alive? Well, the answer is they don't. Someone else keeps them alive. These cells are called the companion cells. Do we not? They're like small cells on. Think of the sieve tube elements as like the large tubes. Think of them as large tubes, and then the companion cell is like a small, like a relatively small cell on the side that nourishes both itself and the sieve tube element. So these companion cells keep the sieve tube elements alive so that it can continue to transport sugars. This is important because sieve tube elements need to be alive at maturity to transport sugars because xylem, the main force that propels its sap is like pulling. So transpiration will pull water through xylem, and therefore it doesn't need to be alive. But the sieve tubes, on the other hand, push sap into sieve tube elements so that it like the pressure increases, and then it it goes where it needs to go. We probably have a slide on that. And then now let's talk about primary versus secondary growth. So, primary growth is a plant. These are just like fancy vocab. Primary growth is a plant growing taller. Secondary growth is a plant growing bigger, wider. Plants undergo what is called indeterminate growth. So, humans have determinate growth. After a certain age, they stop. They stop like growing taller. Like I'm like stuck below 6 feet. Because humans have determinate growth. They have a certain period where they grow and then they stop. Plants on the other hand, if they keep getting the resources for growth and development, they will continue to grow taller and bigger, right? So anyways, primary growth, the apical meristem, these are the brown cells on the right. These cells carry out primary growth. They extend the shoot itself. This gives rise to protoderm, ground meristem, and procambium. Excuse me. And the protoderm, these are like hemi-differentiated cells. Protoderm becomes dermal cells. Ground meristem becomes ground tissue, and procambium becomes vascular tissue, right? And then the secondary growth is carried out by lateral meristems. So there are two types of these. So there's the vascular cambium, which it adds secondary vascular tissue. I'll get into that. And the cork cambium, which these are meristems near the edge of the plant. It replaces the dermal tissue with periderm. So it secretes, it makes like boxy, waxy cells that are tougher than the actual dermal cells. And as it divides, the epidermis will actually rupture, break off, and is replaced by the progenitor, not progenitors, you can think of them as the offspring of the cork cambium. Okay, so let's talk about the primary growth of each organ. Ooh, that's a lot of text. So the root also has an apical meristem. This isn't just limited to the shoot. The apical meristem produces all of the primary root. This root is divided into 3 zones. division, elongation, and determination. There's a lot of text, don't be intimidated. It's relatively straightforward. So division is where consists of the meristem and their immediate product. So like this is the place where the meristem will divide into their own cells. Then you have elongation. This is in this zone, the cells will take up water and grow longer, right? This elongation pushes roots deeper into the soil. So the elongation of cells makes the root longer and therefore reaches deeper into the ground, right? And in the zone of elongation, cells begin maturing, and in the zone of differentiation, the cells do mature. So here are the 3 different tissues of the roots. So you have the epidermis. It has root hairs. These are like small finger-like extensions that increase the surface area of the root, make it easier for the root to absorb nutrients. It doesn't have a cuticle. Then you have the ground tissue, which is mostly parenchyma. It stores food and transports water and ions to the vascular tissue. It also has there's a layer called the endodermis, which we have a diagram later, and there are large intracellular spaces between the 2 different between different ground cells. Then you have the cell, which consists of a pericycle and vascular tissue. So the pericycle is just tissue that surrounds the vascular cylinder, and the vascular tissue is, well, this vascular tissue. Then other structures include the root cap. It secretes a lubricating polysaccharide, and it protects the root meristem. So it like makes it easier for the root to extend into the soil and protects the meristem against abrasion. Then you have root branching. Lateral roots arise from the pericycle, push through tissues disruptively. So lateral roots arise from the region right outside of the stem, and as lateral roots form, they actually like expand into the existing root, and then they rupture out and then grow into their own root. Shoot primary growth. This is not much different from root primary growth. You have apical meristems, which are protected by like small leaflets. One important thing to note, like I said before, is apical dominance. So the apical bud, the top bud, will suppress dormant apical meristems. The presence of an apical bud suppresses axillary buds. So for that reason, if the plant is growing like vertically, it suppresses the axillary buds from branching into new branches. Some more about plant anatomy. You have the stem. Parenchyma cells, there's collenchyma tissue beneath the epidermis, and this provides flexible support. Sclerenchyma fibers provide support in places that stop growing laterally. So in regions of the plant that no longer expand, sclerenchyma will provide more rigid support. Eudicot stele is arranged in a ring. Monocot stele is scattered in the stem. So eudicot vascular tissue is arranged in like a ring within the stem. Monocot stele is like all over the place. Then you have the leaf anatomy, cuticle and stomata. The leaf is has 2 types of these are ground tissue. So the palisade mesophyll and the spongy mesophyll, right? So the palisade mesophyll is like the top layer of the leaf, and this layer light hits it first, and it's specialized for absorbing light. The spongy mesophyll is on the bottom layer, and it has a lot of like large intracellular spaces that produce more surface area, resulting in more gas exchange. Leaf anatomy, cuticle and stomata. And they also have bundle sheath cells that coat leaf veins. Yeah, I already went over that. Then you have secondary growth of the vascular cambium. So the vascular cambium forms between primary xylem and phloem. So in a plant that just underwent primary growth, you have primary and they have primary xylem and phloem. So these are the first xylem and phloem cells. The vascular cambium will arise between the two, and it'll start producing new xylem and new phloem. So the phloem will be on the outside, xylem will be on the inside, and yeah, the vascular cambium also gives rise to vascular arrays, which transport nutrients between the xylem and phloem. So what you should know is that the secondary xylem, the xylem that is produced by secondary growth, makes up most of the mass of the trunk. So this provides like the structural support for the actual trunk itself. You have heartwood, which is old secondary xylem. So this is like the internal most layer, and it's filled with resin. This is xylem that's no longer used for anything except for support, right? And then you have sapwood, which is the newer layer of secondary xylem. This transports sap. This is called xylem sap. It's just water and the ions within it. Then one interesting thing about the vascular cambium is that it forms tree rings. So depending on the season, the vascular cambium can either produce a lot of xylem or a little bit of xylem. This is because like when it's summer, it's like depending on the season, there's different amounts of water, and therefore there's different amounts of xylem that you need to transport that water. And as a result, by looking at the size of the tree rings, like the size of each individual layer of xylem produced, you can tell how the weather, like the drought conditions or lack of a drought, or like what's the opposite of a drought? A flood? Like how much water there was at that time. And then this is the other meristem we talked about, the cork cambium. The expanding xylem causes the epidermis to rupture, right? So as the plant grows bigger, the outermost layers, epidermis, can't keep up with the rate of expansion of the internal cells, and it will rupture and like slough off. Think of it as like peeling skin, peeling bark. And then the cork cambium will produce cork cells, and these are you can think of them as kind of sclerenchyma cells. They produce cork in their cell walls. Suberin, they deposit suberin in their cell walls, and this has a similar hydrophobic tough property, and this gives outer layer its not structure, its strength. One misconception is that you might think that only the cork cells make up the bark. That's actually not true. Bark is definitionally anything outside the vascular cambium. So bark includes phloem, cork cambium, and the cork cells. So it's all three of these, right? And then you also another structure of the stem and formed by the cork cambium are lenticels. These are slits in the cork. They're like openings, like horizontal openings within the stem that allow for gas exchange. So this allows the stem cells, the cells of the stem, to do cellular respiration by providing them with oxygen. Plant developmental plasticity. This is a concept that plants can develop into different like structures depending on their environment. As you can see here, this one plant, depending on whether it's above or below the water, it can create radically different structures. Like below the water, it has a branching thing. Above the water, it forms flowers and lily pads. Cell division. In cell division, in plants, the cell plate, instead of like cytokinesis and pulling apart of the cells, you actually build a wall between the two cells, and that's what separates them. And asymmetric division is important for assigning cell fates. So if you look to the right, you have this one big cell at first, right? And it divides into a bigger cell and a smaller cell. And then the smaller cell divides into guard cells. So sometimes the shape of the cell will give it's important for its specific function. So in this case, the guard cells develop from smaller cells, which is it's helpful for its function. How animals grow, cell expansion in plants, plant cells grow bigger by taking up a lot of water. So they basically like drink a lot, not enough. They drink a lot of water, and as a result, their cells stretch a lot, and that's what causes them to grow. Animals, on the other hand, grow by producing protein-rich cytoplasm, and that's a lot more expensive to produce. Hence why plants can grow really fast. They just take in water, and then they expand. Another important thing, mustard plants are the model organism for plants. It's just like a trivia thing. Arabidopsis. Symplastic dynamics. So the symplast is the term that describes the internal environment. So everything inside the cell wall is the symplast. There are plasmodesmata that connect two different cells. These plasmodesmata can expand. They link neighboring cells so they can exchange different maybe hormones or solutes or whatever. Moreover, phloem can transfer large molecules and electric signals. So plants also have like electrical stimuli, not stimuli, but they also communicate with electricity. They usually use calcium as a conductor, transmitter. They use calcium to convey the signal. It's generally a lot slower than animal cells, but it allows for a pretty rapid response. Water is absorbed and transferred into xylem by roots. So water absorption, root hairs absorb water. Soil solution is, so the root hairs will bring in water in the soil, and then it eventually transfers it into the stem. If it goes through the root hairs, then okay, real quick, it is 8 o'clock. So if you guys need to go, you can go. Thank you for coming. I have maybe I'll try to speed run this. It depends on how fast I can go, but I'll just get to the end of this chapter and then maybe we'll cover it next week, or what's it called? Or we'll post the slides. Yeah, but you're free to go. I'll stay behind and finish up the lecture if you want to stay. So yeah, transfer into the xylem. So water can either go through an apoplastic route, which is to say it goes between the intracellular spaces of the root, or it can go through the symplastic route, which is to say it gets absorbed into the root cells and then transported through towards the vasculature, right? What was I gonna say? Eventually it will hit all water that tries to enter the vasculature will hit what's called the Casparian strip. And this is a belt made of suberin. This is, remember, suberin is the hydrophobic substance that is found in cork. This prevents this prevents water from going straight from the soil through the extracellular route into the vasculature, right? So this is like a filter. Water must first go into a cell to be transported into the cell. Yeah. Endodermis, then the endodermis, which is like the outer layer, or the very inner layer of the ground tissue. It will passively or actively transport the solution into the xylem. So it'll like pump ions and water into xylem so that it'll get not only get pushed up, but also one interesting thing is the endodermis will pump ions into the xylem, and then by passive diffusion, water will move into the xylem by itself because there are ions in there. So they can both, it can be both active and passive. Right? And then, excuse me, another thing, transport within xylem. There are two methods by which water moves up through the plant. The first is root pressure, right? Root pressure is think of it as there's water builds up in the roots, and water builds up in the roots and it like increases the pressure, and then as a result it gets like water gets pushed up into the stem. Probably don't have time to go into detail. Think of it as that. So water gets like concentrated in like the roots and then gets pushed up. But that's like insubstantial. It's like a maybe, like maybe it helps a little bit, but the majority of the force that goes into pulling up water is called the cohesion tension hypothesis. So this says that water molecules within xylem will link to one another by hydrogen bonds, right? They connect to one another. And as a result, they form like a chain of water molecules. And the cohesion is so strong that it has the strength of like a steel wire of a similar diameter, of course. But that shows how strong the intramolecular forces are. At the leaves, a process called transpiration occurs. So think of it as, so you have a water molecule in the xylem, and then a water molecule in the stomata, right? The water molecule in the stomata evaporates. So it like flies off. It flies into the atmosphere. But because there's hydrogen bonding between the water molecule that flew off and the water molecule in the xylem, the water molecule that flew off will like pull the water molecule within the xylem. And as a result, because water evaporated, it like pulls all of the rest of the water up. Does that make sense? So think of it as you have a long string, and you like if you pull on the top of the string, everything else on the rest of the string at the bottom will come up as well, right? So think of pulling up the string as evaporating a water molecule. Yeah, that's that. Oh, okay, for those of you that are still here, who wants me to continue this? Who wants me to finish? I have like a few slides left. Okay, I think maybe I stop here. Well, thank you all for coming. I think we'll either finish this next time or we'll post the slides on our unofficial Discord. Yeah, you're free to go.